Thanks so much for joining us. It is 10 o'clock Eastern. I'm Ana Cabrera reporting from New York, and we began with a deluge of news about the special counsel's election interference investigation, as Donald Trump is told that he is a target of that probe. This morning, we're learning that Trump has reached out to leading congressional Republicans to strategize. Here with us now, NBC's Vaughn Hilliard and legal analyst Lisa Rubin, along with NBC senior reporter Jane Trim, as well as Hannah Moldavan, a former January 6th committee spokesperson, and Barbara McQuade, former U.S. attorney out of Michigan and MSNBC legal analyst. Okay, so Vaughn, first, talk to us about what Trump is saying. What do we know about these conversations he's having with Republicans on Capitol Hill, as well as at these events he's had since his announcement of this target letter?
Right. He made multiple stops in Iowa yesterday, including sitting down for an hour with Sean Hannity on Fox in front of a couple thousand Iowans. But I think it's important to note the conversation that we now know that he had with Kevin McCarthy and Elise Stefanik, two of the Republican House leaders. And this is so reminiscent of what Hannah and the January 6th committee lived through last year. And that was Donald Trump urging Republican lawmakers and other allies to come to his defense. The hard part for McCarthy and Stefanik and Republicans is that it will be defending him on the merits of any potential prosecution, not actually the events that transpired, because Donald Trump has not denied the fact that he pressured Vice President Mike Pence to send back the certifications. He has not denied that he sat in the White House and did not place calls to Pence or the Pentagon for help on the day of the attack. He has not denied that they tried to fundraise off of these false election claims. And I want to let you hear a little bit from Donald Trump yesterday, because this is more than a defense of him legally. It's a defense politically of the movement that he has overseen over the last years. At least that's what he's telling the voters. Take a listen.
If you say something about an election, they want to put you in jail for the rest of your life. It's a disgrace. But if somebody wants to question the cheating, they want to call you a conspiracy theorist and all these other things.
And the politics of this is directly attached to whatever comes legally for Donald Trump. Because in the year ahead, if in fact he is the general election nominee for the Republican Party, he can make the case that his potential freedom is on the line. This is more than the White House. This is the freedom of the leader of the MAGA movement.
It's interesting that Republicans are quick to defend when they don't even have the evidence. They don't even know what the charges may be that he could be accused of. What do you expect to happen from here now? Because we've seen this sort of once before, right, with the federal special counsel and the charges involving the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case. Lisa, is this, do you think, going to follow the same path?
I think it'll be quicker. The last time we went through this, Trump was notified he was a target of the investigation, and we know this from public filings on May 19th. He wasn't charged in an indictment until June 8th. This time, I think it may go a little bit quicker. Trump is required to let the Department of Justice and the special counsel's office know whether he's going to come into the grand jury. We expect he won't by the end of today. Thursday was the outside deadline for his actually doing so. I expect the next steps will to see his lawyers meet with folks from the special counsel's office, if they'll take that meeting, and or request an audience with senior leadership at the Department of Justice. I don't expect Merrick Garland or his political appointees to want to have that conversation, because, as they keep saying, this isn't about us. This is about the special counsel's office. We appointed the special counsel purposefully to insulate this from the politics that Kevin McCarthy and his friends keep insinuating is driving this, and it's not.
We're just getting brand new information. Two attorneys with direct knowledge of this target letter sent to former President Donald Trump are telling NBC News that within this letter, there are 3 federal crimes or federal statutes that are mentioned: deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to defraud the U.S., and tampering with a witness. Barb McQuade, what does that tell you?
It's very interesting. So conspiracy to defraud the United States strikes me as the big one. That would be one that would be sort of from beginning to end, saying that the election was stolen, the fake electors, pressuring Mike Pence, pressuring states to submit new slates. That was probably all encompassed by this conspiracy to defraud the United States. It's basically using a lie to try to interfere with a function of government, here the lawful transfer of presidential power. Interesting about deprivation of civil rights. I don't know if that'll be directed at the voters whose civil rights were there was an attempt to deny the voters of certain states their actual passing votes, or it could be directed to Mike Pence, the efforts there to pressure him to abuse the power that he had. And witness tampering is really interesting. It may be that there was some witness who received pressure from Trump or some member of his campaign to tell lies, to refrain from telling the truth or the whole truth or destroying evidence. So, interesting collection. That middle one that you described, it does not surprise me at all. The other two sound very interesting.
Let's take a look at some of the big names that we know of who have testified before Jack Smith and the grand jury there in D.C. These are the ones that may look familiar to our viewers, of course. The former vice president, Mike Pence, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, former Trump aide, Hope Hicks. There were dozens of others we know. Hannah, how sprawling do you think this investigation is, given how close to Trump Jack Smith has managed to get?
Yeah, Anna, the select committee was able to interview hundreds of witnesses, and we had even fewer mechanisms to do that than Jack Smith has, right? We already know of individuals that Jack Smith has spoken to that the select committee could not speak to. Let's think Mark Meadows. We received documents from Mark Meadows, but we never spoke to him. Mike Pence, who you just named there. Even folks like Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel, he was more freely able to speak to Jack Smith because of some of the rulings in the courts that said executive privilege, you don't have to worry about that here. So we know that Jack Smith has more information, even more than the information the select committee presented to the American people, and more levers to get that with the stronger power of subpoena than a congressional subpoena is. So we can expect a lot more information even than the select committee showed to the American people from Jack Smith and his team.
We also just saw new charges in Michigan related to the fake electors scheme there. 16 people now facing forgery charges. Jane, I know this is something you've been reporting on. Fill us in.
Yeah, Attorney General Dana Nessel brought charges against 16 Michigan Republicans who she said knowingly falsely forged sort of official certificates claiming Donald Trump had won the 2020 election and imposing as Michigan's electors to the Electoral College. This was part of that scheme to try and give Vice President Mike Pence something else to count on January 6th. Of course, we know Biden won Michigan in that election. These people faced 8 felony count charges themselves. Some of them are party sort of leaders in Michigan. You see Kathy Burden, RNC committeewoman. Michelle Maddock, who was a former co-chair of the state GOP party. They face 8 counts each. And these are the first false electors to face charges across the country. Other states have so far declined to prosecute.
So, Barb, we know Jack Smith's team has reached out to officials in a number of states with fake elector schemes, including in Michigan, along with Wisconsin, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Nevada. There's also the Georgia investigation, of course, where the Fulton County DA recently gave fake electors immunity in her probe. So, Barbara, there are obviously a lot of layers between the state level actors and the president of the United States. I have to wonder, how difficult could it be to prove Trump was directly involved if this is, you know, the alleged criminal activity Smith is referencing, at least in some of these or any of these charges in his target letter?
I would imagine that Jack Smith would want to look to see whether there was anyone coordinating this effort across the country. We heard in the January 6 hearings that Romney McDaniel received calls from Donald Trump and John Eastman to discuss this, and she didn't want anything to do with it. The fact that all 7 states coincidentally came up with the same plan to submit these fake slates of electors suggests that there was somebody organizing this. In Michigan, I know there were some people who declined to sign that fake slate of electors because they knew that what they were signing was false and a lie and was an effort to deprive the voters of Michigan from the actual count of their vote. And so the mere fact that they've been charged in Michigan does not preclude Jack Smith from charging them federally, although he may prefer to focus on the leaders and the organizers of this scheme and leave for the states to prosecute the individuals who knowingly signed these false slates of electors for the purpose of defrauding voters.
I mean, easier to prosecute somebody whose signature is on the line, right? But how do you connect that to Donald Trump?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what Jack Smith will have to look for. So there's nothing that would prevent the states from charging these individuals. But I imagine one of the things that Jack Smith has been examining is whether he can make that link. And that would be important. You can do that with witness testimony. Perhaps John Eastman has provided that testimony. Perhaps Mark Meadows has provided that testimony. Or it may be somebody whose name we've never heard, an operative whose job it was to interact with each of these states and gather this up as a plan. So that'll be something we'll be looking for in the indictment to see whether they can connect Donald Trump to the fake electors or even to connect Donald Trump to the violence that occurred at the Capitol.
So, Hannah, you mentioned that the January 6th committee wasn't able to talk to everybody that Jack Smith's team has been able to call before the grand jury, Pence being one of them. He was directly involved in the events of January 6th. He talked to the special counsel grand jury. Here's how he has reacted to Trump's target letter announcement. Listen.
President Trump's words that day were reckless. I had no right to overturn the election. But with regard to the prospect of an indictment, I hope it doesn't come to that. I'm not convinced that the president acting on the bad advice of a group of crank lawyers that came into the White House in the days before January 6th is actually criminal.
Hannah, that part, trying to claim Trump may have just been led astray by, as he called it, crank lawyers. What do you make of that?
Yeah, Anna, the Select Committee was very deliberate in speaking to campaign advisors, senior advisors, the White House counsel, all the folks around Trump who told him he lost the election. And also, we have testimony that shows that he knew he lost the election. He both said it and took actions that showed that he knew he lost that election. When it comes to the former vice president's words about him not knowing about Mike Pence's role in January 6th, we also know that to be not true because John Eastman said that he acknowledged his plans were not constitutional, and he acknowledged that he had told the president that. So Donald Trump, like the big lie that he was propagating, was continuing to bring that through his plan, his multi-pronged plan that ended with Mike Pence on January 6th.
So many more questions I would love to ask each and every one of you. Got to leave it there today. Thank you all so much. Hannah McDowell, Barbara McQuade, Lisa Rubin, Vaughn Hilliard, and Jane Tim. My appreciation to you all. Thank you.